I couldn't get it to become a tradition that we, once a month or once a quarter, would screw up one stamp such that we'd turn them spines inward or something. It would be easier.
Yeah, that would be fun.
But it didn't take.
Yeah. I often think about that. Sometimes when I rearrange my shelves, for a while I didn't have all my shelves sort of operating, from A to Z. And I had things kind of separated into sort of categories of books and things. So it's always kind of a big production to sort of take the books and make them fit some type of new organizational scheme or new set of shelves, which actually I'll be doing, I suppose, when I move. I'll be probably leaving the shelves that I have where they are, but taking a good number of the books with me someplace else. I should mention, before I forget, I have a strategic planning meeting for my historical society that I'm still actually I'm ending my presidency of the board in June, but I am gonna go to the strategic planning session, which is kind of all day next Saturday. So I'll miss next Saturday, and we'll have to kind of recommence on the 18th. I wanted to mention that before I forgot. I made myself a little note on the card.
That may work out well because this is a pretty dense book.
It's kind of dry. Yes.
Oh, I know. Well, it's dry in reading, but there's so much stuff.
Yeah.
This is one of those books I'm going to have to read at least twice to really get what's going on.
Yeah. Well, and it's challenging in that there are no people in it.
Well, outside of my first quote and one snippet highlight, the very first note I made about the book was 200 pages of notes after the narrative.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, so this is going to be maybe slightly the opposite of the last one in terms of. Anyway, so the first thing after the title and author, in rereading the title and sort of having looked her up to see who she was and where she's coming from, I didn't know her name. I instantly go to a nice large monologue quote where hidden in the middle are these 2, 4, 6, 8 words. And the 8 words are in the middle of a phrase, in the middle of a sentence, in the middle of a paragraph, in the middle of like 9 minutes of monologue. And to get it really correct, you've really got to go through the first half. You don't really need the second half. And in some respects, you can stop at this point. You just can't then close with the one word that the original closes with, because there's more. And the quote is, "We wage war on poverty, not on poor people." So
interesting. So and so Chris, what is it
Chris
that contextualizes
doesn't need Google for this.
Before it?
None of us really should need Google for that quote. Yeah. Maybe. Yeah. And that was that, and it's the. By the time I get down to, in the intro piece, while wages in the US have been stagnant for decades now, for the first time in history, the country's richest 400 families pay a lower overall tax rate than any other income group. And it's, my response was, oh no, not again. And it's the Caesar and Zuckman, The Triumph of Injustice, how the rich dodge taxes and how to make them pay. So I instantly thought of my second round go of saying what action should we take. The comment about the last book was saying it's all a very good history, possibly well laid out and expensive, maybe not, but we were having difficulty with that. But she never gave us a solution.
Yeah.
And yet, this is like page 10. And while they haven't, this author hasn't given us the actual solution yet, one of the quotes or the reference from which she took the quote does apparently, at least from the title and the intro, have a solution.
Well, and I think that I mean, by chapter 3, I was starting to kind of warm up to the idea that, that she really is kind of interested in this moment of cooperativism or cooperation or the foundation of co-ops, and the idea that that this, that there was this sort of artificially produced wave of austerity, to sort of self-consciously destroy them, and that's an interesting. That would be an interesting narrative, right? Drilling down into that would be kind of valuable. The thing that jumped out to me in the introduction was the third paragraph, which was the one on Greece, because I think that has some really interesting elements of of the fact that, well, this was she doesn't actually say it, but this was something that was sort of imposed, as I remember it, sort of imposed on Greece by the World Bank and the IMF, as part of kind of structural adjustments that were required in order to do additional financing. And so there are all those ideas of there sort of being these different levels of at which the discussion is being held, and almost I mean, it's sort of delightful if you're a conspiracy theorist to sort of imagine it that way. That was one of the things that sort of jumped out at me from very, very early on in this. I was a little bit less enthusiastic about although I am interested sort of in Italian history, especially in that era around the First World War, because it was like just before that moment that all of my ancestors, in the decade before the First World War, arrived in the U.S. But this idea of hierarchical, she talks about the next page, she talks about Togliatti and Gramsci, and this idea of breaking hierarchical relations of society and top-down knowledge production. So one of the things I was having a little conversation with Tracy on Substack this week, because she's just started a new. She's really kind of sort of elevated her level of what she's putting out there on Substack, and kind of focusing on this, on these ideas of progressivism and stuff. And I've always sort of imagined the progressives as being very kind of top down and technocratic. So this all sort of fits together for me. But in any case, what did if we kind of start at the beginning, what are people's sort of first impressions of this? Or Tim, expand on what you were saying.
You touched on something that sort of struck me as I was reading through, and that's back on the co-ops. So you go particularly to the Basque area of Spain. Is that Mondrian group of co-ops? They're colourful co-ops, basically. They've had in the last 3 or 4 years, they've had a couple of really big slices leave, because it's not imposed by you. You belong to the cult because you want to belong to the cult, and it made me go double take, which I hadn't done to date, was just how much did other corporates who were outside help with sort of mousetrap cheese type baiting of the 2 or 3 big slices left, that once they'd left the umbrella, how well have they done since? And it was in the same vein as of the usual thing about the light bulb conspiracy of to 10,000 and the 2,500 hours back in the the 10s, 20s, 30s, and 40s.
Right.
And the residual of that goes all the way back to the big myth readings, etc.
Right. Well, and also the idea that, sometimes you don't need a conspiracy when you have a set of shared interests. People can just all read the writing on the wall.
Yeah. And of course, it's election week in the UK. It'd be a bit like your midterms. It's like a third of the local, all of the non-national governments were being having about a third of the councils were up for re-election, and a number of independents or new people got through, but still the 2 main parties are still the 2 main parties. And on many things that are now temporarily troubling, they are one and the same.
You mean it's kind of a uniparty like we have in the US?
Well, there's a bit of that. And I think there's an element of the same as there is with the uni-party elements being spoken about for the US. We've got to get something done. We can agree on this, at least enough to get it through both sets of votes. So let's do that. That's what gets reported on. Therefore, that's what gets done. And that's what's on everybody's mind. All the other things we're at loggerheads about but are getting nowhere. Everybody's just fed up with the ongoing stupid, debate in whatever flavour that happens to be. So therefore, people drop off. And it's like I looked at one of the headline council results, and it's like 27% turnout, and it's so 27% of the people for that constituency made a 40-odd% change to which way the vote went from last time, and took the Conservatives out, put Labour in.
Which is interesting because the initial that goes kind of counter to what she says in here about when she's kind of going through the early period, the sort of the pre-World War I period, and she talks about how really it was that labor came into being because there were several million more voters after the franchise, after the reform, when the franchise was improved, and so that's hopeful then to think that maybe that can happen without having to go find an additional several million votes or 50% of the population who hadn't been represented in the past.
Yeah, the downside is it's not a national one. It's about 1/3 of the councils. So if your council was up for vote, it's all up for vote. But the next council along might not be. So, for instance, my old long-term home of Bath wasn't up for election. But at 27%, and a council flips by 40-odd% in numbers of votes from last time, you've got to wonder And it's not, and in recent times, there hasn't been a group of people that have suddenly got the franchise. You know?
Mhm. Right.
It's literally the between war years is when everybody got it.
Right.
And
Well,
that's
it would be interesting to see in that result that you got that 40% shift, if there was, a mobilization of of a majority that had previously, not been going to the polls or something like that.
could be, but I can't think of why, at least from this time to last time,
Mm.
why that would have changed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you go from when I first voted to now,
Mm-hmm.
possible, but not for the last 1, 2, maybe 3 sets.
Mm-hmm.
The one big thing that's changed, of course, is in UK more or less, is Brexit.
Yeah.
We've been in Europe in one form or another for as long as I've voted.
Right.
Until now, right? And it was rarely an issue in the voting I did, except for when I was able to vote for my European representatives.
Mm-hmm.
And they were regional. So we didn't have that many, and we also changed the vote structure such that it's no longer first past the post, it's a proportional representation, such that my region had 30 seats, but I couldn't say that person for that seat. It was, I have a proportion of the vote capacity and it's for those 30 seats.
Right. Yeah.
So there was that complexity or complication that I also think meant that, it's not British. And it's like, when did you ever design the first past post? Go see, Pompey versus Julius type thing, with literal first past the post type voting.
Right.
You've got to walk between the posts to be counted.
Yeah.
Same as they do in the House of Commons. You have to walk through
you have to walk into the lobby. Yeah.
Yeah. You've got to walk out the chamber, walk back in again, and go through the yes or the no door. And it's not even like you guys going, no, hey, no, hey. Round the room. They have to move.
Right. Which does seem like it adds a little bit more consequence to it, but maybe it's been that tradition so long that they don't think about it.
Yeah, you can't say. The annoying thing, of course, is you could then, and there have been instances of people getting a bit shoved around and roughed up outside the chamber because there's less security in the lobby. You're not allowed to cross the line in the House, and the line is 2 sword lengths away.
Yeah. One of the things I did want to address early on, I think it's still in the introduction. Yeah, it is in the introduction. She says she starts talking about about sort of in the section right at the beginning of the section called Austerity Then and Now. She starts talking about the classical economists, Smith, Ricardo, Malthus, and then she says. And then there is, these sensibilities of these classical economic ideas are also reflected in, she says, in 1821 with the institution of the gold standard, a policy whereby upstanding governments demonstrated their fiscal and monetary rigor by linking their currencies to their holdings of precious metals, which is not incorrect, but I think it sort of bypasses the very important element of that is not only the thing that Graeber had been talking about the sort of the establishment of these of these quote unquote objective standards. It's also, and I think it's very relevant in this conversation, a demonstration that these were colonial empires that had the military wherewithal to accumulate large supplies of gold, right? And so that I think is something that we that it will probably, that I imagine is going to be relevant for this discussion in this book about state power, because it's something that
Well,
is kind of it's an assumption in kind of basic classical economics that we never acknowledge. Sorry, go ahead, Chris.
well, you go back the generation or two, or 8,000 years before that, and it's the trappings of power were always wrapped up in gold and silver and jewelry and shiny objects of all sorts generally. So even before you're talking about that period, you're looking back, and this power structure that existed before was built on that same edifice essentially. So it's I for me, I think looking at this and the argument that I think she's trying to make, and the introduction seemed very hand wavy to me. Whereas she's actually delving into more of, it seems more history than economics, or historical economics rather than economic history. But it's a tough job she's got to do. But I think the interesting thing for me is watching from the present period, watching our system being not completely built, but pieces of it being built in that span of across the two wars, in two different places with two different political perspectives, both Britain and Italy. So you get two different cultural pieces. So she's got to build enough background for the average person who has some basic history to know what Britain and Italy look like before the wars, and then how they look like now.
Right.
And then she's also kind of doing that thing across two different areas. So it's two different cultures and two different eras. What did they look like before? What did they look like now? And what is the effect of austerity on those two cultures, to make her point, which is a lot of moving pieces to be able to kind of follow this. And not only that, but there's a lot of political subtlety in what she's saying across those times for those people. But it seems interesting to me to watch that narrative play out, to see if her thesis that, austerity is a constructed thing that's meant to keep the poor people in their place in some sense. So it's kind of like, as a dad of a 13-year-old, I still look at my daughter and see the 2 and the 3-year-old version of her. And then you're struck with, oh, but she's 13, and I'm still seeing her as I saw her a decade ago. Or the way, if you work at a big company, everybody in the big company, especially the older people, are going to always see you as the new employee, even if you've been there a decade or two. Like, oh, you're still the new guy. So you almost have to change companies and go to a new place to get the new level of respect and that change. Or if you're old like us and you don't look in the mirror for a few weeks, and you're like, oh wait, I've either gained a lot of weight, or I look older now, because you haven't been watching the subtle changes. So to me, reading this book is watching that history of seeing those subtle changes that you, as a human being or a person in life, life happens to you, and unless you look back and reflect, you don't necessarily see that change. So I'm really curious to see her lay out that change over time and see if it holds up. But man, it's a hard thing to pull off.
Yeah, and it seems like maybe it seems like there's a danger, and I haven't read far enough to know yet of forcing that that issue, and so that'll be something that I think we'll need to be on the lookout for. Yeah, one of the things that also kind of strikes me about this is, along this way, and maybe again it's just the stuff that I've been sort of reading and writing about this week, the private versus public element of this, right? Because because that what you were talking about at the beginning of what you just said, Chris, that sort of state power and I guess this is all still the prehistory of what she's really going to be dealing with throughout the book. In Great Britain, becomes this sort of mercantile empire, partially by sort of renegotiating the public versus private location of these powers, right? That we had a you started by saying something about sort of royal power and prerogative, and then we get sort of that era of the chartering of merchant adventurers, and then colonial projects and things like that, and then it kind of comes and goes, right? There are parts of it that are that are more in the private sector, parts of it that are more in the public sector, and I think that I've only read to the end of chapter 3 so far, and it does seem like there's going to be a lot of that sort of thing. When we get the cooperative movement, when we get the sort of who is it that reacts at later on in chapter 3 to this co-op movement. It looks, the way she presents it, very much like it is an action of government, but probably not one that they necessarily took on their own or thought up on their own or whatever. So this and these economic assumptions that she's making, at the beginning on the first page of part 1 of chapter 1, the war and crisis thing, she talks about in naturalizing these institutions, right? Private property and wage relations. We're getting to this place where she says they're no longer understood as historical institutions, right? People have forgotten that there was a time before them when they weren't really, they weren't really just kind of ground truths, right? But we have gotten to this place where they are just sort of assumed to be true, right? And I think I thought that it was valuable and kind of important that she kind of pointed that out, that we're assuming some things about again, classical economics, the invisible hand, all of that stuff. Also, excuse me, I'm going to close my door for a minute because my family has just returned home and the dog is losing his mind. So the idea of things like durability of ownership, right? Actual ownership, all these assumptions, right? Ownership of natural resources, and corporate sort of immortality, right? And the ability of corporations to own access to natural resources beyond the lifespans of their directors or owners or whatever. All of that alienation stuff that is just sort of kind of an unspoken kind of ground truth of these things, I think are I thought it was valuable that she called attention to that, I guess is my point.
Part of it, I think, historically, it is like it's a battle between two worldviews. You have the capitalists and the socialists. And it's interesting because I've always objected to, if you're not, it's like this model of the world based in capitalism, and if you're somehow against that, then you must be a socialist. And it's like, well, what would happen if there wasn't a third force, if there wasn't government? And you kind of see it in different phases here. There's this big swing from pure capitalism to the workers kind of take over for a while, and you have a view of socialism, and then somehow that gets disrupted by war, and then there's an explanation, austerity, for why capitalism can kind of regain its footing and take control again. But to get back to my annoyance with being called a socialist, it's like it ignores the notion of government, and even, you know, what is that? Is that a third party out there that's completely devoid of any connection? Well, not really. I mean, it's really us in a way. But you can have capitalism. This is what we keep thinking this country is about. You can have capitalism, but then you can have this other party called government that provides a social safety net and some other basic features like that. And so you can still find a way to believe in capitalism as long as this kind of a collective commitment to government works, because it's going to kind of deal with fairness and equity and all these kinds of things. I don't know. That's just the way I read something like this. It's like, okay, we forget about government. We have this phase, and then the alternative kind of took over for a while. And that's kind of where we're at by the end of chapter 3 or so. And why does it keep going back this direction, which is what the mechanism of austerity accomplishes in some way, which isn't fair.
It's almost that same dichotomy that Graeber had in Debt, where he says, you know, yes, you have capitalism, but there's also this communist with a small c communism. And in our daily dealings with our friends and family, we're totally communists from the start, because that's how we are. But we live in a world where people outside of that immediate sphere, it's all capitalism to some extent. Or my friend, I'll dig up a link to it because he may have some more subtlety to it. But Jerry Mikulski talks about capitalism as the cuckoo egg in the nest of political economy. And once that cuckoo egg is laid in the nest of how we all work, somehow it manages to take over and push all the other things out and away from it, and take over and dominate in a way that is just not sustainable or controllable in an easy way. And it's tough to not think about it. Once you've heard that idea, it's like every time you see capitalism or how caustic and terrible it can be for certain things, yet somehow you can't get rid of it.
Well, it seems to me that it's like it's based on a flawed assumption. And the assumption is the government, which is kind of like the referee in a boxing match or whatever. You assume they're neutral.
Right.
And in a one vote, one whatever person mentality, that's the way it would be. But once you understand that politics really doesn't work that way, the people with the resources have a lot more power, even though they have the same number of votes.
The government's not a rep; they're a player.
That's what breaks down the idealism of the system.
Yeah. A couple of things. The cuckoo egg, I think, the cuckoo when it hatches and it pushes all the other chicks out of the nest. I think there was a moment that I highlighted where later on, I think it was in maybe the 3rd chapter, where the people who are objecting to, I think in Italy, the people who are objecting to the cooperatives and the cooperators are calling them Bolsheviks, right? And I think that goes kind of to what you were saying, Mark, about what is socialism and what is it not. And I think that a lot of the time, I think you've got the enemies of socialism defining it as Marxism, right, and defining it as Bolshevism in this era of the Bolshevik Revolution and everything, and that is a way of sort of, that's an attack mode, right? That's a way of discrediting these people who I think were much closer to what Chris was talking about, the Graeberian idea of small c family communism, because it sounded when she's describing these cooperators that they're talking about things like sharing, right? They're talking about things like, about having a wage that continues when people are injured or out of work or whatever, in the British guilds, or you're talking about people having a there was even a passage where she's talking about, somebody was saying we want to have meaning. We don't want to just be, mechanisms in this production line, in this equation. We want there to be some meaning and some holistic kind of value in the work that we're doing. So in addition to just sort of having a say in it, also, kind of making it more, making work more kind of meaningful and spiritual. But that question of the government's not the ref, the government's a player, right? And the government's the player, that has the guns. And then finally, and then to go back to the very beginning, the thing that really kind of fascinates me is that it's war. It's the war that creates these conditions, not only of austerity and having to kind of rally around, and deal with that, that scarcity and that panic, but also control. Right. So all of a sudden you've got these allocation boards, you've got these price control boards, and that happens again in the Second World War as well, right? That the government and the US government in the Second World War gets even more involved in that, right? And basically nationalizes the whole American economy. And I hadn't really thought about that, but that's the moment. She has put her finger on it. That's the moment when capitalism becomes something different. I think you're muted, Chris.
I'm on mute. It's weird too, because during the war, hold on, let's put a pin in capitalism so that we can, let's move totally to socialism and price fixing and austerity and all these issues so we can maintain capitalism is the goal. But it's like, oh, all the people have gone off to war, so if I, as a woman going into the marketplace, you really need me now, and I'm worth $100 an hour. Oh, but the government says, minimum wage and maximum wage are both set at $5 an hour. Then, well, I'm screwed. Like, why are you pushing pause on capitalism? Literally, at the point you're going out to fight a war against socialism and communism with the capital C, in all the senses. What the hell's going on? Like, if capitalism is the thing that will solve all our problems, why it ought to solve it during wartime as well, because it's mighty capitalism with a big capital C.
Yeah.
And so that's what strikes me there is like that kind of just really odd. And I don't think I ever have heard or seen anyone talk about that as a thing. Let's come together as socialists so that we can beat the communists. Like,
right. Oh, we came together as kind of fascists.
It's the same way the Christians decide, let's be so anti-Christian that we go out and defeat all the Islamicists and I guess nobody wages war against Buddhists except for China, but
or the Tamils.
It's Christians saying it's about time we knocked off all these Cathar heretics.
Right. Yeah. Because they were communists.
The thing that was making me grin more than maybe was sensible a few months ago was this thing about socialism, communism, with Bolsheviks and Mensheviks and etc. And it's like, so what party was El Duce in before he was El Duce? He was a socialist. And before that, he was a social syndicalist. So then, of course, I haven't read far enough yet to find out whether she manages to make a distinction correctly between fascism and Nazism. Um, and the way that the company, the corporate, got treated between those two Axis powers. And I've never bothered in that context to go then look at those poor other people over in Japan to find out what did they do, because once the emperor got reseated, I sort of lost interest in, because Tom Cruise makes all the difference. And it's like you've got two countries in Europe that as a whole country have got less than like 50 years or so of history each, then causing most of World War One and World War Two because of how they got treated. And for hoops and machinations that various leaders go through. I mean, even if you pick up with, say, somebody as apparently consistently as shit as Churchill was, he hopped parties as if parties were no different than, oh, I'm going to move house.
Mm-hmm.
And when he hopped parties, he moved the house, literally the house.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The House of Commons.
Lord Randolph's son.
Yeah. And Daddy's in the other house.
Yeah.
I'm in this house.
Did Daddy become a lord ultimately? Randolph Churchill? I don't know if he did.
I'm pretty sure.
Did he? Because he wasn't.
They don't all take their seats.
He wasn't the Churchill, right? He wasn't the occupant of. Well, I guess he did occupy Bletchley Hall, but he wasn't.
It's not Bletchley. It's Blenheim.
Oh, Blenheim Palace. That's right. Yeah, I'm sorry, Blenheim Palace.
No,
I was thinking
place, not palace. It's
okay.
place.
Oh, it's a place. Okay.
And I think then you move out to like the 50s and 60s, and you've got corporate capitalism but under the guise of a CIA playing around footloose, fancy free with the Italian elections. And it's like, and it's like, that was the time when we, amongst other things, that we managed to get eventually our second and third Labour governments, and then Harold Wilson, and Harold was tarnished with the brush of being an asset of the KGB. And all the inquiries that brought up, and the conversations that were being had over brandy as whether young Louis Mountbatten would actually act as an interim government if somebody went out and brought the army on the streets. And a sufficient number of the officer corps said no. Thankfully, I assume, but and then Heath and then Maggie came along, so it was all fine after.
Yeah. Well, okay. So during this period, though, we have this moment, and I do wonder, what J.P. Morgan or Thomas Lamont would have thought about all of these ideas, whether or not this question of the what you were saying, Tim, about let's pretend that we're doing that we're having socialism, that we're letting the government control these things. I wonder to sort of what extent they're involved, kind of in the background. But there is this kind of interesting issue, where she does talk about how impressive it really sort of becomes, where the this model of, she says, directly managing firms under private ownership, to the extent that you've got almost 902,000 at least workers in 1915, that are being whose work is being directed by the state in 2,000 industrial businesses. And I guess the assumption is, right, that these are being managed in a way to produce the maximum, that they can produce for for the home front and for war production at just kind of break even prices, so that there isn't a moment, at least in Europe, where people are making huge war profits, which is significantly different in the U.S. Right there. I mean, there's huge war profiteering in the First World War, because we're not really a direct player. So so we don't play with that model until the Second World War. Right?
Well, I think
making
of the
profiteering.
What's
Is
that?
it
I'm
the
sorry?
lower classes or the upper classes, the people in charge of the government or the people not in charge of the government? In all of these cases, who are the war profiteers and how do they manage it?
Well, and can sort of consolidating this kind of power be seen as as kind of a self-conscious investment in future profiteering?
Or is there a level or a lack of morality by the people playing those games? So if you're war profiteering with government help at the highest level and you don't care because you don't see the effect on the little people, it's a lot easier to do. Much the same way I think Donald Trump can throw verbal and political grenades into he doesn't care about what the outcome is as long as he is at the top and in power and getting the attention. He doesn't care actually about the little people who he presumably is supposed to be representing.
Right. But he's destabilizing people's power bases, right? And that's probably a big objective. I listened to a podcast. I don't think it was this week. I think it was last week. It might have been the All In, where they were talking about Llama 3, which is the new version of Facebook's generative AI. And basically their thesis was, I think they agreed that Facebook is going to push that, they're going to push that into the market for free in order to basically cut the legs out of everybody else's business model, because they don't see that. They think that their profits are derived from elsewhere. And so if you take away the value of the thing that your adversary or your opponent or a competitor is deriving value from by pushing its by circling the drain with its pricing, and making it not viable as a business venture, then that's going to give you a leg up. And I kind of see this these people as sort of doing this in kind of a complicated way.
well, how many people actually pay for email service? I mean, Dan, you're still on your academic one. Mark's probably still on his academic one. I'm quite happy with Google Mail, as it were, in spite of the fact they're all being read. I'm glad they're being read because I don't read most of them.
Yeah, I'm on iCloud too. Yeah.
So, but I was trying to get a bit earlier and thinking more on World War II, where yes, the millions of people that the US mobilized, some of whom came overseas and some of whom put life and limb at risk, compared to the number of people that were mobilized in an industrial sense. And I was thinking, one of the reasons why the UK industry did so well, even with all the bombing, was every factory that could turn a wood item was there building the hurricanes because it was or mosquitoes because they were wooden planes. So they took all the brand new technology of inline engines and high power engines and machine guns and pressurized cockpits and all this, and then 4 or 5 of the key devices in that war, they went back and said, okay, now let's make it from something that we can totally decentralize. So there is all of those small woodworking furniture shops and piano makers and you know, garden fence makers are suddenly turning out de Havilland mosquitoes and hurricanes and bits for the Spitfire and stuff. And which was a secret apparently, because they didn't want to disturb the population, makers of coffins. Because they obviously all of a sudden you need hundreds of thousands.
Sure. Yeah.
And it comes back with everyone's favorite aircraft manufacturer at the moment, of course, Boeing. You know, not only do they kill passengers of their planes, they kill employees. They clearly stepped up from being a relatively small industry compared to shipbuilding, steel, and cars to being an all-consuming biggie for that war and never let go. So thinking back to your comment a few moments ago about, or Chris's comment about, if I'm allowed to gerrymander my business with backing because of circumstance, how do I ensure that I then don't get taken to court when those circumstances return to normal, and or end up by being accused of being, you know, a war crime or something? At which point, my automatic thoughts go to Coca-Cola. Because Coca-Cola US told Coca-Cola Deutschland, you have to still pay your franchise fee.
Right.
But we
may be at war, but let's keep our priorities.
We're at war, but we're not going to give you the syrup because there's an embargo, right? And partly because of the materials they could get were very chemical as opposed to natural growth products, farming produce. Coke Deutschland invented Fanta.
Oh, okay.
So it's Nazi Coke in some respects. So
I didn't realize that.
And so Coca-Cola Deutschland still exists because it made enough money to keep its existence going by making Fanta. Right? Similarly, the other quirky, stupid from World War II thing, and to a certain extent touches on several other bits of information we've had from various places, is data's valuable, right? There's a value to data which we never actually price unless you happen to be on a census piece of data and you happen to be Jewish and the Nazis just turn up. And so IBM US said,
We'll sell you some Hollerith machines. Yep.
Germany, if you want to maintain your relationship, you must continue to buy the cards, which is how they manage the business from us, right? And so there was a bunch of Hollerith specialists on the front line. Every time they got into a city, they want that machine, they want those cards, and the first pass question they give for cards is, which cards are Jewish?
Right.
Which cards are homosexuals? Which cards are political? Which cards are the intelligentsia? And let's round those people up first.
Yeah, that Edwin Black book is good. IBM and the Holocaust.
It's a good book.
Yeah. Yeah. I wanna go to this to what you were saying about sort of the setting of the expectation of government, because I thought that was a really interesting moment. It's around page 55 in my Kindle version, and she's talking about the beginning of the expectation of the state having a role in social welfare, and that being especially operative in Italy, where they really had never thought of that before. They already had a welfare state in Victorian England, but she's talking about this vice president of the Italian House, Dr. Michele Pietravalle, saying the undelayable duty of the state to safeguard citizens' rights, especially those of the underprivileged classes, was now a categorical imperative. And then this law professor goes further and says the war has silently enacted a great revolution, embodied in the introduction of audacious legal principles that could even be named state socialism. So for me, that was a really interesting kind of unintended consequence of this, state grab of the levers of industrial power. Right now, all of a sudden, there's the light bulb goes off in some people's heads that, oh, wait a minute, it's not just private mill owners and the dark satanic mills, right? It's this is the use of state authority to organize these industries and to direct these workers and to set these prices and to manage these markets. So now all of a sudden, because of the understanding of what states are for, right, we have this idea that this economic power and this political power are somehow not alien to each other. Right. And so maybe going forward, there should be more conversation about that rather than just sort of handing it back to the private players and saying, okay, it's all back, it's all for you to decide.
And UK wise, of course, the tangible realization of that in a big way is the NHS.
Yeah, right.
There's that standard mean of how many people have been privately made bankrupt in the last year in Japan, the Netherlands, Belgium, UK, Sweden, Switzerland, France, due to medical bills. The answer is zero. And for whichever year you pick, there's some humongous number of people that have been made bankrupt because of their US
absolutely
medical bills.
Yeah, we were having a med management virtual meeting with this new person at the U of M for my son, and she was saying something about a particular thing that hopefully we won't have to get to because she said the insurance will cover 90% of it, but it will still cost you $10,000 a year. So we're like, yeah, okay, let's not go there. But yeah, it's crazy. There's a moment a couple pages after that thing that I just read where she says the Times and other British bourgeois publications are observing the Italian scene with worried eyes, and the Daily Herald, apparently a leftist paper, says, will British workers, following the example of Italy, resort to violence in order to defeat the profiteers? Conan Doyle predicts they will, unless something is done quickly and thoroughly. So there you go.
The other one, of course, sticking with the capitalist and the free market for a moment and not leaving too far of a metaphor, if I have a certain treatment here, right, or in the UK and pay for it, it's still like 10% of what you pay.
Yeah.
So if you've got a free market where the providers are competing, how is it they're competing to be the biggest possible price as opposed to the most useful price to the user?
Because
there isn't a
market.
Don't live in the land of the free.
Right. Because it isn't a market. Yeah. Clearly. The insurance will pay and the insurance doesn't care. Yeah, Chris, what were you?
I was going to say that seems to be one of the big shifts too between Britain and Italy of this time at, roughly the turn of the century. Britain has largely undergone industrialization, and a lot of people have left farms and small towns and moved into kind of bigger cities or factory cities and are working at factories, whereas that's not the case in Italy. And in Italy, the majority of the people, and it's either in the introduction or chapter 1, she says, are still small family farmers. And we have to remember too that the level of communication among these smaller people is almost nil. You talk to your, friends and neighbors across the way, but it's not easy for you as a small family farmer at that point to kind of gather together and create political power versus the government from the top down doing it.
I had some questions about that, actually.
But Italy still has a very big actual north-south divide.
Yes, that's what I was going to say, Tim. I have some questions about what she's saying there, because I think that total numbers, gross population statistics, she might be right about, but I think that the Northerners, and especially the industrial North, Turin, Milan, right, are much more involved in these conversations than anybody south of Naples who they don't count at all.
Yeah, but it's a level, I think, it's a level of town, city versus village, rural. You have to know your village neighbour because collectively you survive and do better. You don't need to do that in a town, but you can always find somebody in a town, as in find a different doctor or a different dentist or a different baker. That the competition is there such that you don't have to rely on whatever the storekeeper was in the Waltons, because he's the only storekeeper in town.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
I think
that's a big shift.
Yep.
Yeah. But how you then mobilize that mobility of choice sufficient to then break the way that corporatism is now. So there used to be, I don't think there still is, but there used to be 2 major high street only traditional shops for electrics and electronics, as in fridges, washing machines, calculators, cameras and stuff. One was called Dixon's and one was called Comet in the UK. Sorry, Dixon's and something else. I can't remember what something else was now. Out of town, their competitor was a company called Comet. And Comet was a bit sort of like a Walmart type. It's always out of town. You always need your car to get to it, with 1 or 2 exceptions. Whereas Dixon's and this other one were on the high street, and there might even be 2 branches to a town.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know till 85 or 86 that Dixon's and the other one, I can't remember what the name is still, is the same company. At the top.
So it's Aldi's and Trader Joe's.
So they are very, very clear that they are 2 companies. But the final holding company that is listed separately as our business is to hold companies, these two companies do this stuff, they're competitors. We just have 75% of the shares of both of those companies. So it's a bit like Warren Buffett saying that his 25% equity in the four big airlines means he actually has a good choice from his frequent flyer margin and shareholding to pick between the four, and not a fifth, sixth, and seventh. So there's clear, and I don't know whether that was an accident of history or something that somebody thought of very quickly and deliberately.
Yeah,
there's the other businesses that we see as a townie and city person is the department store. So I've often wondered about that, because every town used to have its own and different department store. And then certain department stores, like in the UK, Debenhams and Marks and Spencer's particularly, started to do, and John Lewis went into different other towns and bought in partnerships and stuff.
Right.
And now they've contracted as well. So
and in America, we had Federated Department Stores. Was actually a corporation. So yeah, there were different organizational structures before there was, just that kind of monolithic, couple of siloed. Yeah, I mean, there really aren't even that many competitors anymore. Yeah, the one of the things that, to go back to the rural urban Italian thing, one of the things that, and I think it's a little bit later, it's Second World War, and I think it's really, I think the partisans in the Second World War were in the North were sort of fighting the fascist state that Mussolini, with the help of the Germans, establishes in northern Italy after they throw him out of Rome. But there is that, that whole Bella Ciao, kind of story of the Italian partisans, and I think the song Bella Ciao was originally sung by women going to the rice fields. So there is kind of I think some, and I don't really understand it, and I can't really speak to its history. There is a kind of a cultural connection between the ideas of anarchy or small s, socialism or cooperative, kind of movement in Italy that spans from the countryside to the cities. It's also at the beginning of chapter 3. It's also interesting that she kind of tips her hand, right? She says, if one is to argue that capitalism was crumbling during this period, as I do, then the unparalleled surges in industrial action in Britain and Italy are exhibits A and B. So so apparently, I mean, I guess that's how I'm gonna understand the rest of the argument in this book, is that, that there was a capitalism which existed up to the First World War, and then it became something different. And that's kind of an interesting way of thinking about that, because it's not the way we use the terms, especially large C capitalism, the capitalism that we're defending, that goes along with democracy with a capital D. So the idea that has fundamentally changed and is no longer to be understood as what it had been when it was being built during the Industrial Revolution, during the age of the robber barons, right? It's now a different thing. I think that may be a little bit artificial, because I think that a lot of it, especially in America, and she's not talking about America, but especially in America, a lot of it gets built with the help of government, and so it's much harder to distinguish. But but even in that instance, there might be a way to understand that as, that something fundamental kind of happened that shifted the way that we understand it, and we should develop new language to understand it. I love that moment, though, on the next page, where she says, the change in the electoral base from 5.2 to 12.9 million. Okay, so now we have the Labor Party, right? And that's to me that's a little bit depressing, right? The only time we can get a major political shift is by finding a new set of people, because everybody else is too embedded in the parties to which they're committed.
I'm waiting. It's too late in America to have an agricultural party because it's all gone to big ag in the last 40, 50 years. And the kind of the workers' party, the big unions that did industrial work almost don't exist because we've offshored all of our manufacturing. So I'm waiting for the service workers' party is really the thing. Right. And they don't seem to be coming together at all to do.
Yeah, for a while there was some talk in the alt news about that guy Chris, what's his name, who was trying to organize the Amazon warehouse workers, right? So maybe a new labor thing, but then Optimus will get off the ground, and and nobody will be doing any work, and so we'll just be fighting about the level of our UBI payments.
I've seen some work, and apparently somebody internal to Amazon let leak their numbers, and there's a specific word for it, but Amazon is so big and so caustic in a lot of the communities it's in. The poor underclasses who need work will go work for them, but only for limited amounts of time because they're so stressed out doing the work, or it causes them physical harm, so they quit. And there's a churn rate at which some point becomes unsustainable, and then the people just won't go back and work there anymore. But I haven't seen big Amazon warehouses disappearing from the places where they were originally situated and moving on, while we're hearing about all this, unionization business. But eventually, presumably, there's some burn rate at which those cities and sites will burn themselves out. And that's going to be a huge issue for Amazon down the line, because picking up and moving factory and warehouse space like that is not easy or cheap.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of cities now know from a tax-based perspective that vying for that business is not useful or economical for them, in much the same way that cities used to fight to get Walmart to come into town, but they were doing it at a rate that they were giving away so much, tax incentives to get the business into town, right, that after a few years or a decade or so, if it wasn't successful and they pulled out, they couldn't replace anything. So they built up this population and had eroded the tax base. But then Walmart put in stipulations that for 5 or 10 or 15 years after, a big box store could not come in and replace their business on that location in that store. So you just have this empty shell of a building sitting there that's unusable. Nobody will buy it. No one can touch it. And meanwhile, you still have to pay the fire and the police and the schools to do the job that Walmart was not giving you tax money to do. So right, you've shot yourself in the foot.
And you put out of business the tax-paying FW Woolworths or whatever had been on the main street previously. Yeah.
And all those small businesses are not going to come back suddenly.
Yep.
To replace that. So
well, everybody, so then you can put in you can turn over that Walmart to a UPS facility, because everybody will be buying from Amazon Prime. The funny thing about UPS is they were, I think they still are, Teamsters. So they're actually deeply embedded in.
Are they still holy, or are they tiered?
I don't know. It was a long time ago. I was a Teamster when I was packing trucks. That was, I guess, that was a long time ago. It's like going on
There
20
was
years.
I think there was a small Supreme Court case this past week that determined that if you're driving a bakery truck, you're in the trucking industry and not in the baking industry, which is pivotal for some curious tax and labor issues.
Mm.
But that was one of those things that just totally flew under the radar for, I think, most of America. Or I think I only noticed because in California there's a new law recently for fast food industry workers getting a $20 an hour minimum wage is a new thing that has raised, fast food prices.
Mm.
But one of the issues was if your primary business is baking bread, you don't count as a fast food thing. So there was a question of whether Panera Bread, which is a kind of a fast foody type of business, do they qualify for this $20 an hour thing or not? So
Wow.
apparently bakers have a bigger lobby.
Wow. That's, yeah. And then So we've got and then we've got this description of kind of the things that co-ops did along the lines of of what I guess a Panera gets everything from everything that comes into Panera is probably from corporate. They probably have their own distribution system, and I get and maybe that has something to do with whether or not you're a fast food organization or a from scratch baker, right? Does your flour come in pre-mixed with in a Panera package, or does it do you just get the raw materials and do your own thing? Tim?
The obvious one that is going to be the how many angels can sit on the head of a pin type argument is Subway. Because Subway as a corporate franchises out most of the outlets. I mean, oddly enough, this shopping mall's got 2 Subways on 2 different floors, and they're 2 different franchises. And the product is identical.
Sure.
Right? Plus, part of the reason why I ask is if I go back to my old great aunt's bakery, who's a traditional baker, I mean, he could see the mill, right, where the wheat came from. It was that local, even though the UK is not great for bread, grain. And we used to go twice a day. So we had literally butter melted on hot bread for high tea and early dinner as school kids. But Subway put 57, 56 other things in their bread to make, amongst other things, the fact that it's consistent worldwide. And more importantly, now because they want to be worldwide, it's consistent worldwide, and there's no difference between the kosher, the halal, and the normal bread. They don't necessarily advertise it, but you go to the Subway in the UK, and about 50% of them are halal for everything else. No pork, amongst other things. And the other one that I found out recently, there's a guy called Tim Spector. He's a research, I want to say biologist, but he tends to do on nutrition mostly. Medical doctor and research, on nutrition. And one of the things he picked up on was there's a similar number of things added to McDonald's fries to make them consistent. And it's like, I've got a potato and I can pre-cook the chips in water if I want, or I can put them into oil. Provided it's at a temperature, I'll get a chip out. Why do I need 56, 57, whatever it is, other stuff? Now, salt maybe when you finish cooking them, but yeah. That level of industrialization brings on other issue, the Amazon type thing, is it focuses down, and you go back to what we were saying earlier about competition between companies, etc., and all the rest, and you look at who owns the brand, because they're no longer companies in a normal sense. Look at who owns the brands, and it's like, for the industrialized West, and we look at particularly the city people, stroke towns, and you look at a standard Walmart supermarket shelf low, and it's like 90% of those foods didn't exist 90 years ago. And then there's in brackets in the meme, and neither did 90% of the diseases. And it's like, when you go and buy food. Don't buy the processed.
Right. Well, I think it's interesting that
that's where the industrialization went. Having done the aircraft and the tanks, etc., we don't quite need so many of them as we did in the 1940s and 30s. We put industrialization somewhere else.
Yeah.
Because they all geared up to provide the food anyway.
Yeah. It's interesting that along the way, they're starting to realize these kind of flaws in the system, and I think that that's an interesting element to this story as well, right? That along, again, my page numbering is based on Kindle, so I don't know if this is accurate, but around page 85, she's talking about the coal industry and talking about this Sankey report, right? It says, in the case of the coal industry, the effects of the invisible hand were not as optimal as Adam Smith had promised. Numerous depositions emphasized that far from being virtuous, competition for profit had not resulted in collective prosperity. Rather, it had created a lack of coordination and excessive waste, combined with a structural disincentive to undertake the kind of long-term investment that was needed to increase the supply of coal and keep prices low. So it was becoming recognized that it wasn't working, right? And that's an interesting moment, I think, in this thing. Oh, there's the balloons. I don't know what they're there for. We're going to party with the balloons. So the balloons. Can I make that happen again? So, and then she goes on a paragraph and a half later. She says, the problem of competition producing inefficiency could potentially be solved by unification under private ownership. Another source of inefficiency did not admit of such an easy solution. So there is this idea that if you allow corporations to get super big, right, to the types of things that antitrust is designed to combat in America, that maybe you could, maybe the cartelization that is an element of fascism in the Mussolini sense, right, is potentially, this AI is driving me crazy. Is potentially useful, but it doesn't. But the source of inefficiency that is not amenable to being corrected by that is this antagonism between workers and managers, between what she calls capital and labor, and so that doesn't. That's not. She's already identifying that that's not something that that just having fascism is going to alleviate.
Well, it's weird too. The feedback loop for corporations and even small companies under capitalism is a lot faster. So if you're doing something and it's not working, you're going to see it and realize it more quickly and change it, versus that same type of corporate structure doesn't exist in government, which has much longer time frames of operation.
Right.
But
Which is
and
Hayek's argument, basically.
I'm reminded of Beatrice Webb's like late 1800s study of the 1832 poor laws I mentioned a few weeks ago.
Right.
So it took almost 60 years for her to go and look at the data that came out of those laws to show that they were horribly formed, they were ineffective, and either let's get rid of them or let's change them. But it took 60 years in the mid 1800s. And, I would submit that generally, other than kind of knee-jerk reaction, cultural reactions that people may have to specific laws, when they're being debated, nobody's paying attention to, I'm trying to come up with a good example. Every now and then we talk about laws that affect, let's say, social media that were made in the mid 90s that we're operating on now. And every now and every 2 or 3 years, it comes up as a thing, and we haven't changed it, because if it were contingent upon Facebook kind of vetting everything every person posted, they would go out of business immediately because they can't do that at scale.
Right. So Section 230. Yeah.
So those laws, they flare up every few years, but very rarely do we go back and look at, or, this last couple of weeks in Arizona, they're looking at an a Civil War era law about abortion, because we think that's going to tank the GOP's chances in the upcoming election if we don't get rid of it. So they're siding with Democrats to change the law. And the governor who had been anti-abortion is now suddenly, oh, maybe I'm a little bit abortion because, 1865 just doesn't work for us.
Yeah.
But it's very rare that we go back and look at those older laws and take them off the books or amend them or change them based on outcomes of those things, or even subtle shifts in things like FAFSA is a big one in the news lately.
Yeah.
Department of Education, let's change the way we do this. And even though it got screwed up, and they knew it was going to be screwed up for the unroll this year, they didn't roll it back. But what does that look like next year or the year after? Do they actually fix the problem to make the change, or do they suddenly let that shift sit because they notice something different happen? But in general, the people are not going to decry the situation, or not going to be loud enough in a big enough group to force a change. And so that horizon of change, scientific change, and with Winslow in the early 1900s doing scientific principles of management for corporations, which got huge uptake, we saw nothing about any of that with respect to governments or society. And as a result, we let these small little changes sit and go on for years. Or things like, hey, maybe we should be legislating some controls for AI right now, but it's going to be a decade before enough people in government or in the House or the Senate have enough knowledge about what the hell's going on to be able to write any kind of legislation. And guess what? When we do, it's going to be the people who are in power in AI with lobbyists who are writing those laws for themselves rather than the other way around. So, how do we, maybe some of what she's asking here is how do we fix that?
Well,
But she's not saying it. I don't think she's saying it explicitly.
with big tech, if you get far enough ahead, then you welcome legislation because you are financially better able to deal with restrictions and alterations and even payments of penalties that are anyone who might come up to compete with you.
Yeah,
And
it's a barrier
AI
to
is a
entry.
unique, AI is a unique problem. I mean, in my opinion, in that so much of the development now is beyond the reach of smaller intellectual bases such as universities. And so, you know, it's in a way it's out of control because only the big companies are capable of doing it. So you have all these, you know, entities that are beyond the reach and reality of the rest of the normal system.
Yeah, that's ironic. It's funny that I was listening to give myself a little break this week as the my semester was winding up. I listened to the audiobook of Douglas Adams reading his own work, reading Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency, and there's a line, there's a passage in there about because one of the couple of the characters work in the computer industry, and so there's a line in there about whether or not AI based on some particular language like Lisp was going to was going to gain any type of ground, that sort of thing, and it was, and I guess, I mean, Adams died right around 2000, so this was probably written in the 90s, and so I thought that was kind of interesting that that we used to think that there would be that AI was going to be some type of kind of coding revolution, and not what it turned out to be, which was this this kind of data harvesting was going to really be the the basis of its success.
Well, the tech failure that I always think I might rue, but I'm not so sure because of what the consequences is, that classic tiny storybook, The Sentinel, that gets made into 2001, and you've got the lead early human goes to a terminal the size of a normal wardrobe to make a video call from the space station back to Earth, like not far.
Right? Oh, right. Yeah.
And it's supposed to be 2001. And it's like, okay, 2008, I'm walking around with a Sony CyberShot mobile phone, and I can phone the same distance with voice, albeit not video, but it's only a couple of years later. I can then phone Skype wise.
Right. Well, in 2008, the iPhone comes out.
Yeah.
2007.
Yeah. 2008, the iPhone comes out, but there's still not face-to-face talk because there aren't enough iPhones and not enough traffic. But face-to-face comes out, I think, the iPad, isn't it? Because they want a bigger screen.
FaceTime, yeah, probably. Yeah. Yeah.
We go back to the way legislation works or doesn't work. The one that I think of as being a relative funny ha-ha caught out with the unintended consequences in a socialist metaphor, at least. Germany, after reunification, had clear problems of equality at the working man's level.
Mm-hmm.
Even. And one of the things that they changed in the social network within Germany, the now combined Germany, was that you had only so many refusals of a legitimate job being offered to you that you could refuse before they started chopping away at your benefits. So you couldn't always make yourself unemployable simply by not saying yes to a reasonable offer. And a year or so later, from a different direction, they decided to make prostitution not illegal. Then younger women started complaining about the fact that they got their benefits chopped because they turned down the bar job that was a bit more than a bar job, as in drinks with blowjobs, and therefore that's not the business you think you want to socially support, right? And there was not quite riots on the streets, but I saw the change, as in I could walk, I couldn't walk down certain streets in Frankfurt and not get accosted. Whereas Frankfurt was as safe as pie, provided you weren't sort of waving a Nazi swastika type thing. Literally months before.
And Frankfurt is still Frankfurt's where the European Central Bank is, isn't it? Still, I think.
Yeah.
It's so. So we get to the end of this, kind of to not all the way to the end of this section, to the part just before co-ops and guilds, but we get to this moment when we get this first kind of response by government that she talks about, right? Where, and she says, this economic depression was not a natural disaster, but rather the outcome of a well thought out policy of the Treasury and the Bank of England that operated to drastically deflate the economy by increasing the interest rate and curtailing credit. So now, she's kind of putting a stake in the ground that this is, kind of what we were talking about earlier about, the work of some type of coordination between business interests, banking interests, financial interests, and government to undermine these political movements that are, kind of based on this expectation that the war, we've got this whole story where the war sets an the government does particular things with respect to business that creates an expectation. And so that expectation has to be, people have to be disabused of that, right? That has to be undercut.
So I was just going to say, so my read of that was a little subtler in that she's almost be positioning that the government is acting against itself, that the central bank and the banking interests are acting against this sort of legislative ministerial alliance with the workers, or with the workers' improvement,
which suggests that the government isn't a single thing. Yeah,
correct. That's sort of, and I don't know if that's going to evolve in section 2. I haven't started it yet.
Yeah, right. I hope it does. Yeah, because I think that's very contemporary as well, right? The whole idea of a deep state or whatever.
Independent central bank versus a which is part of but not part of the government.
Yeah, and these things that are adjacent, that are adjacent to elected democratic institutions that maybe are kind of more powerful. And then she kind of backs away from that. I hope she does go back to that in part 2, but because that does seem to me to be, if she's gonna talk about, the things like she was beginning with the Greeks and the Chileans and stuff, there's definitely a global independent banking and financial power structure that is, I imagine, hard to ignore. So, but then she kind of backs away from that and gives us this moment to bask in with the Italian co-ops and the red biennium, which I wasn't even aware of. I'm gonna pursue that a little bit and read this Buffetti from 1921, that offered an overcoming of private capital accumulation and traditional wage relations. Workers are members and owned the means of production, and controlled the surplus if there was one. And then in the British guilds, they don't even accumulate a surplus, right? If the costs end up being less than they had gotten prepayments for, they refund it to the home buyers, whether it's a municipality or a private enterprise, which is interesting.
Can you define for me what a guild is? I've heard of it before. I can't figure it out. I mean,
it's a trade. It's a trade producing.
So it's not a union.
Organization that actually effectively controls who has a license to become a cobbler, a goldsmith, a gunsmith, or whatever. So if you also find that those guilds form many of the early schools. So, and some of those schools still exist in terms of buildings and names. So the haberdashery school in London is literally those people that did all of the bits and pieces for clothing. They ran a school for their guild members' children, and they therefore also formed trade schools for anybody. So you could be
so would taxi drivers be a guild in opposition
but I don't
to
think
Uber and Lyft?
But it could have been, but I don't think it was, because it's an oddball.
I don't think it, I think that there was an element, as Tim was saying, historically there was an element of controlling the progress of apprentices through journeymen, through master levels.
So it isn't just having a license to do something then.
Yeah. Well, it's also a method if you're in the, let's say, the blacksmiths guild in early Italy, you're also trying to control the number of people who can practice a trade or a craft in a city or an area or a region, so that you don't have too much competition and drive prices down to make things unsustainable for people who are already in the guild. And it also, to some extent, it's a protectionism mechanism, because a lot of the things, so let's say if you're a glass blower, there were methods of glass blowing and manufacturing that were only known within the guild, and it would have been illegal to transfer that information outside of the guild to then allow people in Britain to suddenly start making and blowing glass that then creates issues for those in Italy.
Right, put them all on Murano.
Or let's say in the early...
Well, how about physicians and lawyers?
Yeah.
Well,
yes, but
it's
not a guild. It becomes a professional.
It's professional something that has barriers
but in London, for instance, the building that is next to the guild hall, and the guild hall is the home of the Lord Mayor of the City of London. The buildings next to it are the three main inns of chambers of the barristers and lawyers. So the Lincoln's Inn, Temple Inn, etc., are the groupings of competing guilds for exactly the same product. Whereas normally there's a guild who gets a royal charter that then protects that guild, even if that guild is protected in terms of a geography position, not just the product.
But there is an element of intellectual property protection as well.
There's the intellectual property. There's who gives us royal materials for the product, who gives us raw materials for the tools and methodologies, and where's our labour force coming from, and who looks after the retirees,
and who enforces the non-compete.
And who enforces the non-compete. So
which they don't have in California.
It's also where we get the phrase masterpiece. So you're an apprentice, and as your
You have to
apprentice,
do a masterpiece.
you're building a masterpiece to indicate that you're a master level of whatever your trade is. And by creating that masterpiece, that then allows you entrance into the master level class of the guild to then open your own
So-
shop and leave.
So it's also in things that you might not think of it as such. But do you believe that Michelangelo painted every stroke of the Sistine Chapel ceiling? No, he didn't. His staff, who were going through the apprentice journeyman distance, helped out. He would draw it up, they fill in the colour, etc., etc. But if you go there, if you ever manage to get to that nice place Italy, since it seems to be the other place mentioned, the walls are much, much better than that crappy ceiling. Take it from me, I've been 3 or 4 times now. You know, and the walls are much better. If I think to look at some of my archives, I'll try and get some pictures of the walls put into the obsidian vault so that you can see. But elements of new things like engineers, for instance, many of our professional institutions are exactly the same as a guild used to be. It's just that it looks more modern straight away because it's not run on a medieval secret society type role, even though we have secrets, because the things I get taught about how to size pipework and how to run electrics and how to calculate air conditioning loads.
Right,
You
or
don't
like
know.
IEEE standards or things like that. There has to be some
Yeah. So
place
there's
to agree on things like
many
that.
of those standards are now public, but how to operate them, where they come from, how to do them from first principles. So, yeah, the British building regulations are a public government document. How to manipulate those numbers is not explained in the document, right? Because they don't want Tom, Dick, and Harry doing it. They want people that have trained on how to manipulate those numbers. Because in theory, trained people will tend to follow the path because you're trained. You know, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, etc. So you also don't challenge it quite so much, and you don't challenge it because you don't want all those Fred Bloggses out there to suddenly be able to do your job. And it's insidious in some respects, right. But it's like an airline pilot, you know, or a surgeon. Do you want somebody doing their who did a tonsillectomy for the first time ever last week to do your open heart surgery this week? Not really, right?
Right.
Do you want somebody who could draw pretty pictures that went through a week's worth of class at architectural school to put your house up? Not really. No. The last time I had to sue an architect was because the person was dying of carbon monoxide poisoning. The architect didn't properly ventilate the building, and when you pursue him, it turns out I'm not an architect. I never said I was an architect. Oh yes, you did. And here's your piece of paper. It says architectural illustrator, which is not a protected profession. Whereas an architect with a big A is a protected profession. Same way as a professional engineer, PEng, is a protected profession. Thank God.
It's interesting, all these protections. I mean, the example I would use is the difference between a psychiatrist and a clinical psychologist and a counselor. And there's all kinds of internal protections that I think the general public doesn't know about. So the program I worked in and administrated for a while, I'm not a clinical psychologist, trained clinical psychologists. And it is interesting because external bodies ended up dictating to a university what they had to do. So to train clinical psychologists, you're limited to one student per licensed clinical faculty member per year. So we could only let in 6 or 7 students. The med school could let, it's very interesting. There are other programs that will let in to be counselors, or, you don't get a PhD. They will let in 40 or whatever students, train them in groups. It's not an apprenticeship model. And where it comes down to being interesting is what insurance will pay for. So insurance will pay the clinical psychologist to do certain things. It will pay psychiatrists to administer a drug that a clinical psychologist can't. And so there's all these weird interconnections, which to me sounds a lot like guilds. Partly it's the knowledge. We can't train clinical psychologists in certain. You go over to the med school, and you could take a few courses in pharmaceuticals, and all at once you could administer drugs. But a clinical psychologist missing 1 or 2 courses can't do that.
Well, that's where it gets weird.
But
you have NPs who are, you have nurse
Right.
practitioners who are prescribing, but
That's right.
Yeah.
See, that's what's happening. You see the deterioration of the control of a lot of these mechanisms, partly brought into play by the realities of the market. You can't even get in to see physicians and stuff anymore.
But it's
So
also the distinction: are you called doctor or are you called Mister? If you're Mister and you're in a hospital, it's likely you're the surgeon. At least in the UK, Europe, right?
Yeah.
They're not clinical doctors. They're not allowed to administer pharmaceuticals. That's why they have an anesthetologist in the room with them, right?
Yeah.
And your doctor looks after your recovery, and he gives you pills and lotions and lord them willy-nilly, right?
But it sounds to me a lot like guilds when I'm saying that there are
But he doesn't pick up a knife.
protectionisms, there are access to skills and knowledge.
Yeah.
That
that definitely create moats.
The problem comes is, particularly if you take me, for instance, my university education was overlapping and parallel to architects and structural engineers. So I could walk in to a structural engineer's office, read the drawing. I wouldn't necessarily say I could write it. I could get the books out and redo the calculation if it was done by hand in the first place, which is unusual now, right? But I reckon I would be found out for some, reinforced concrete relatively quickly. But if I walked into an architect's office, they would have a real problem, because I've been the draftsman in the architect's office, because I worked for a big enough engineer. We had some literally in-house, and I could move, and I'm a small fish in a very big company back then. I could move around. And so I've been sitting next to the principal architect or the architectural technician doing exactly the same work.
So who controls how this works? Is it, historically even, does the guild operate only with the authority of the government behind them?
Effectively, in Europe, because it's all monarchies, in effect, with the odd exception, you can see these same types of organizations within the Roman Republic before it becomes an empire. There are people who you are the dying people. You collect all the urine so you can make the dyeing of the cloth properly, right? Somebody else wants to come along because you can make money out of cloth, still has to go for you to get it dyed blue.
Mm-hmm.
etc.
Yeah.
So the guilds, the individual guilds had a charter for a location, a role, and a time to be, in theory, endlessly renewed, because you as the king, the occasional queen, you don't want to throw away that continual dribbling passive income that was huge relatively.
But yeah, and so obviously it's a natural point at which corruption can intervene, right? And you have this sort of rentier class in both government and in the private capitalist sector. So yeah, and people do enrich themselves by controlling these moats and these barriers to entry. It's interesting.
But
in
at some
Germany, I
point,
remember, you were.
would you really want a product from an unregistered person? You look at all the you look at all the snake oil salesmen for medical stuff that was being out of the wagon back in the Wild West, right? Hollywood days, and think, right, okay, the same as there was a meme of a while back that I popped, and I thought, oh yeah, I hadn't thought about that for a while, and it's, Mummy, why does Grandma say that great grandma used to do 5 times as much as you do during the day? And the answer is yes, but that's when Coca-Cola had Coke.
Right. Well, on the other hand, so there is that question of legitimacy, right? But you have to make a bunch of assumptions about how legitimate the and for what reason licensed and guild oriented or licensing oriented. I mean, this was a big issue in the development of the medical profession in America in the first half of the 19th century, right? They were very sad and upset that they were not being treated as professionals, and the other two professional classes that they would look at in their cities or towns or villages were the ministers and the lawyers, right? And those guys were that's what makes balloons happen. So
no, you mentioned ministers and lawyers.
It's
like party time. maybe it is listening to me. So they they were very upset about that, but the solution that they thought up was licensing, right? And it was this control of entry, but the actual way that they imagined that they would license people was in the same way that lawyers and ministers did, was by reference to canonical texts, right? And so the medical texts of Edinburgh, especially, by going back, and these texts would go back to Galen and Hippocrates and Paracelsus, right? And so they had this, the patent medicines were horrible, but they weren't really any worse than antimony and mercury and the bleeding and all of these other heroic treatments that were canonized in these foundational texts of the profession. So it's an interesting sort of, I think, object lesson for what value these controlling organizations think they are achieving and producing and protecting the medical consumer with, and what the reality is. And there may be and especially as knowledge and technology improve, and then the internet has shown us that there may be mismatches, right? And those moats and those barriers to entry may no longer really be appropriate or relevant.
I gotta run in a minute, and we're almost at time. But
we are.
I want to leave everyone with one question as I've been reading this and because we're all inveterate note takers. So as I'm reading about governments as top-down ruling bodies versus things like co-ops, which are growing from the bottom up, what is the ruling government of your note-taking system, either as a top-down or a bottom-up perspective, and how does that affect the end product that you're making? Is there a parallelism between these governmental structures in life versus in note-taking?
And we can consider
That's
that in the
just-
context of the thing that Pat sent me the link to in Substack earlier today, which was about the plugin on the GitHub that would make it, make your Obsidian graph look like Zettelkasten. So that's the context for that for us to consider that in. Okay, cool. Well, thank you very much. We will not meet next week. The following week, we will discuss up to the end of chapter 7, which seems I haven't looked at the chapters, but based on the table of contents, looks like they're kind of thematically related. Oh, cool. Thank you for putting that putting those links. So I'll put the chat up, and then I'll put the video up hopefully later today.
Okay.
Easy,
Well,
everybody.
see you in
2 weeks.
14
A fortnight.
days.
Yeah. All right. Take care.
Have a good one.